January 1943. RAF Molesworth, Cambridgeshire. The frost clung to the airfield as ground crews swarmed around the big bombers, the B-17 flying fortresses that the Americans insisted would bring Germany to its knees. At dawn, engines coughed, propellers bit the cold air, and entire squadrons lumbered down the runway, bound for the Reich. It was the start of America's gamble, daylight precision bombing. But as the formations climbed over the channel, a problem soon became apparent. Beyond the Dutch coast, the escort fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, had to turn back. Their fuel tanks simply could not carry them to central Germany and back. From that moment onward, the bombers were alone. The American plan was bold. Unlike the RAF, who preferred night bombing, the US 8th Air Force insisted that industrial plants and rail yards could be destroyed by daylight attacks using the Norden bombsight. Brigadier General Ira Eaker promised Washington that the bomber will always get through. The Luftwaffe knew better. German radar stations plotted the incoming raids with chilling efficiency. As soon as the escorts peeled away, Gruppen of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf F-190s assembled for the kill. Captain Robert Morgan, pilot of the famed Memphis Belle, later recalled, "We would watch the P-47s turn for home, and then you could almost hear the Luftwaffe coming. The sky would fill with contrails, and suddenly you were in a storm of cannon fire. That was the moment you knew the real fight was about to begin." At 0830 hours, 376 bombers lifted off for one of the most audacious missions of the war, a double strike. Half the force aimed for the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg, the other for the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. The logic was brutal. Cripple Germany's fighter production and its machinery of war would grind to a halt. Ball bearings were the lifeblood of every tank, aircraft and truck. Knock out Schweinfurt and the Reich would suffocate. But the plan underestimated one fact. The bombers had no cover beyond Belgium. The Luftwaffe, warned by radar, massed to intercept. Jagdgeschwader 3, 11 and 26 pounced with over 300 fighters. Lieutenant Charles Red Whittington of the 96th Bomb Group described the assault in his debriefing. "They came in at 12 o'clock high, cannon shells tearing through the formation. Whole forts just blew apart. You could feel the shockwave from planes going down. We stayed in tight, but by the time we crossed into Germany, the sky was littered with parachutes and burning wrecks. 60 bombers failed to return. Hundreds of airmen never made it back to England." On the German side, Oberleutnant Otto Behmer of JG 26 scribbled in his diary that evening, "It was a slaughter. The Americans have courage, yes, but no fighter can protect them once they pass Aachen. We struck again and again. As long as they come without escort, our victory is certain." Despite the losses in August, US commanders believed they could press harder. On October 14th, 291 B-17s launched again for Schweinfurt. This time, weather and poor coordination doomed them. Clouds split the formations. Escorts dropped away even earlier than planned. The Luftwaffe attacked in waves. Fighters, then flak, then more fighters. It was systematic destruction. Sergeant Harold Stivers, a ball turret gunner, survived that day. "I counted 6 fortresses burning before we even reached the target. The Focke-Wulfs were coming head-on, their cannons flashing. We fired back, but it was chaos. When we landed in England, our crew realized half our group was gone. Empty beds in the barracks, empty chairs in the mess hall. The statistics told the horror. 60 bombers destroyed, 17 damaged beyond repair. Nearly 600 men killed or captured in a single day." The Germans celebrated. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring boasted to his staff, "The Americans will not reach Berlin in daylight. They will be bled white before they ever come close." By late 1943, German fighter groups were strained but still confident. Their airfields in France, Belgium and Western Germany allowed them to intercept raids with ease. Commanders like Adolf Galland and Walter Grabmann knew that as long as American escorts turned back at the frontier, their bomber formations were meat for the guns. The war diary of Jagdgeschwader 11 noted in November 1943. Enemy bombers continue deep penetrations but suffer unsustainable losses. Escort fighters disengage early. Berlin and Leipzig remain secure from daylight raids. The Führer need not fear American bombers over the capital. For ordinary German civilians, the narrative was reassuring. Night raids from the RAF were devastating, but daylight, the time of work and routine, remained largely untouched. Few believed American bombers could ever appear over Berlin under the sun. Back in Washington, the losses shook the very foundation of the daylight bombing doctrine. Military analysts calculated that at the rate of attrition seen in August and October, the 8th Air Force would cease to exist within months. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey later noted the unescorted bomber could not achieve decisive results against the German heartland. Fighter opposition, organized and relentless, inflicted losses at rates that exceeded American replacement capacity. Inside the 8th Air Force, morale plummeted. Crews whispered that a tour of 25 missions was a death sentence. Bomber crews began carving crosses on their helmets, grim humour for what they called the long ride to Schweinfurt. Yet among senior leaders, the determination hardened. General Hap Arnold, commanding the U.S. Army Air Forces, sent a blunt telegram. "We must have long-range fighter escort. The bomber offensive cannot continue otherwise." The Luftwaffe, buoyed by its apparent dominance, believed it had time. Its intelligence services reported correctly. American fighters had no range to Berlin. The Reich's war planners assumed that daylight raids on the capital were fantasy. They did not yet know that across the Atlantic, engineers at Lockheed and North American Aviation were refining designs, experimenting with external tanks, and preparing a machine that would soon overturn the entire balance of the air war. For now, in 1943, the truth was brutal. The bomber did not always get through, and Berlin, the heart of the Reich, still lay beyond America's reach. October 1943. Wright Field, Ohio. On the drafting boards of the Army Air Forces Materiel Command, the problem was clear. If American daylight bombing was to survive, fighter escort would have to reach the very heart of Germany. The bombers could not endure another Schweinfurt. A new answer was needed, not just in aircraft, but in endurance. At the time, the standard escort, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, suffered from limited legs. Even with belly tanks, the P-47 could barely make it past the Rhine before fuel gauges dipped into the danger zone. The P-38 offered more, but operational troubles in cold European skies limited its use. The B-17 crews bitterly referred to escort range as a cruel joke. Thunderbolts and Lightnings peeled off just as the Luftwaffe appeared in force. Colonel Curtis LeMay summarized the crisis in an October 1943 report. "The German fighter force engages with impunity. Our escort cannot remain. Bomber morale suffers. Unless corrective measures are adopted, deep penetration raids may have to be suspended." U.S. National Archives, AAF Tactical Reports, 1943. The German diaries confirmed his assessment. General Adolf Galland wrote in his October 17th situation report, "Our Jagdgeschwader enjoy a decisive advantage. The bombers arrive weakened, unprotected. Berlin remains unreachable. The enemy cannot sustain such losses for long." Luftwaffe War Diary, Bundesarchiv. The problem was not entirely new. As early as 1942, engineers had floated the concept of auxiliary fuel tanks, droppable, lightweight containers to extend fighter range. But the U.S. Army Air Forces had been skeptical. Official policy discouraged external tanks. They were thought to reduce maneuverability, invite fuel leaks, and worse, encourage cowardice, allowing pilots to drop their tanks and flee rather than fight. General Henry Hap Arnold himself had once dismissed them as gadgets. Yet by late 1943, the reality of the bombing campaign forced a reassessment. The 8th Air Force was losing 1/4 to 1/3 of its bomber force on single missions. Something had to change. It was Major Benjamin S. Kelsey, chief of the pursuit branch at Wright Field, who championed the tank concept. Kelsey had been an early advocate of long-range fighters, and he now pressed Lockheed, Republic, and North American engineers to improvise solutions. The P-51 Mustang, still relatively new in European skies, was initially a British request aircraft. Designed in 1940 for the RAF, it was a sleek, low-drag airframe with excellent aerodynamics but mediocre performance until paired with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. By 1943, with the Packard-built Merlin V-1650 roaring under its cowling, the P-51B was proving a revelation. Fast at high altitude, agile and fuel-efficient. What it lacked was range. On internal tanks, the Mustang could reach as far as Bremen or Hanover, but not Berlin. Engineers believed drop tanks could change that equation. At Wright Field, experimentation began with two types of tanks: 165-gallon metal tanks, robust but expensive to produce in large numbers; 110-gallon paper tanks, made of laminated kraft paper and glue, designed to be cheap, disposable and resistant to metal shortages. The idea of a paper fuel tank seemed absurd to many pilots. Colonel Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group reportedly scoffed, "You want me to bet my life on a gas can made of cardboard?" USAF Oral History, 1962. Yet tests proved the tanks surprisingly reliable. They leaked less than aluminum prototypes and burned no more readily when hit by tracer fire. Most importantly, they doubled the range of a Mustang. By December 1943, Lockheed and North American had both proven the concept. With two 110-gallon tanks slung under its wings, a P-51B could fly to Berlin, loiter for combat, and return to England. For the first time, deep escort was within reach. Bomber crews still flying unescorted in late 1943 left vivid records of their ordeal. Staff Sergeant William Quinn, a B-17 tail gunner on the October Schweinfurt mission, recalled, "We watched the P-47s waggle their wings and turn back. 10 minutes later, the sky filled with contrails, Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts. They came at us in packs, 20, 30 at a time. I knew then we couldn't do this much longer." 8th AF Oral Histories, National World War II Museum. Quinn's crew lost 2 bombers from their formation that day. He carried home the memory of a comrade's final radio call. "Tell my wife," cut off by static. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, grew ever more certain of victory in the air war. Reichsmarschall Göring famously declared to his staff in November 1943, "The Americans will never fly fighters to Berlin. If they try, they will not return." Trial testimony, Göring, Nuremberg, 1946. German intercept tactics relied on this assumption. Jagdgeschwader commanders like Johannes Steinhoff and Walter Dahl positioned their Gruppen deep in central Germany, waiting for bombers stripped of escort. When the Americans approached Schweinfurt or Leipzig, the trap was sprung. B-17 crews called it running the gauntlet. By year's end, US daylight precision bombing, built on the belief that tight bomber formations could defend themselves, stood on the brink of collapse. The Casablanca Directive of 1943 had promised the Allies an air offensive capable of crippling German industry, but without escorts, the strategy was failing. General Ira C. Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, admitted in a December 1943 memo, "We are approaching the limits of endurance. The losses cannot be endured another spring." USAAF HQ Papers, Maxwell AFB Archives. What few in the Luftwaffe realized, however, was that American engineers had already solved the range problem. The drop tank program was quietly entering production. Factories in Ohio and Pennsylvania turned out thousands of paper tanks, bundled by rail and ship to England. By January 1944, the first Mustangs equipped with external tanks began operational trials. Pilots of the 354th Fighter Group, Pioneer Mustang Group, flew escort missions into Western Germany and returned with fuel to spare. Lieutenant James Howell recalled his astonishment. "We dropped our tanks over the Channel and still had enough gas to dogfight over Hanover. For the first time, I felt like we were going to win this thing." 354th Fighter Group debriefing, January 1944. The Luftwaffe had not yet noticed. In late 1943, they still believed the heart of the Reich was safe from sustained escort. Soon that illusion would be shattered. February 20th, 1944. Early morning, England. The frost still clung to the steel matting of Boasted airfield as mechanics fastened a pair of paper tanks beneath the wings of a P-51B Mustang. On its olive-drab fuselage, ground crew chalked the words, "To Berlin and back." The pilot, Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group, climbed into the cockpit, glanced at the unfamiliar bulges beneath his wings, and muttered, "Well, here's hoping the cardboard holds." 4th FG debrief, February 1944. This was no ordinary mission. It was the opening strike of Operation Argument, later remembered simply as Big Week. The targets, the aircraft factories of Germany itself, Leipzig, Regensburg, Schweinfurt, Gotha, and Brunswick. The risk? Everything. For the first time, American heavy bombers would have continuous escort from the English coast to central Germany. The tool that made it possible was the ungainly paper drop tank. The sight that morning astonished the bomber crews. As formations of B-17 and B-24s droned eastward across the North Sea, the Mustangs held formation beside them, their tanks glinting in the pale sun. Hours later, over the heart of Germany, the bombers expected to be abandoned, as they always had been. Yet when the contrails of Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s appeared above Leipzig, the Mustangs were still there. Lieutenant Colonel James Howell of the 354th Fighter Group recalled, "We hit them at 30,000 feet, still with fuel to spare. The Jerrys didn't expect us. They thought we'd turn back at the border. Instead, we were waiting right over their bases." 354th Fighter Group War Diary, February 1944. The Luftwaffe's shock was immediate. Jagdgeschwader 26 and 27 had massed to tear into the bombers as before, only to be bounced by Mustangs diving out of the sun. German pilot diaries captured the disbelief. Oberleutnant Günther Viechweger of JG-27 wrote that night, "The American fighters did not turn back. They followed us even to our airfields. Never before had we seen such range. It is a catastrophe for our tactics." Bundesarchive, JG-27 Pilot Letters, 1944. From February 20th to 25th, 1944, the 8th and 15th Air Forces launched over 3,800 bomber sorties, escorted by nearly 900 Mustangs equipped with drop tanks. The campaign was brutal. German industry, already strained, was hammered. Regensburg's Messerschmitt plant, Schweinfurt's ball-bearing works, and Leipzig's aircraft facilities all burned. Losses were heavy on both sides, over 300 American bombers and nearly 350 Luftwaffe fighters in 6 days. But the balance was shifting. For the first time, the bombers returned from deep targets with escorts still at their side. Morale, once brittle, hardened again. Staff Sergeant Harold McGill, a B-24 waist gunner, remembered looking out his window during the Leipzig raid. "The 109s came at us head-on, but suddenly they were scattering, and then I saw them, the new long-nose P-51s diving like hawks. My God, they were beautiful." National World War II Museum Oral History Collection. News of these missions reached Berlin quickly. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, reportedly exploded during a staff meeting when told American fighters had been sighted over Berlin on March 4th. That is impossible. The Americans cannot have fighters over the capital. It must be a mistake. Interrogation Report Göring, 1946. But it was no mistake. On that day, Mustangs from the 357th Fighter Group, flying with 110-gallon drop tanks, escorted B-17s all the way to the German capital. Luftwaffe radar operators and civilians alike reported the shock of seeing silver-winged escorts circling above the bombers. The myth of Berlin's invulnerability was shattered. For the German fighter arm, Big Week was more than a tactical defeat. It was a hemorrhage of irreplaceable strength. The Jagdgeschwader threw everything into the defense of the Reich. But each day, more young pilots failed to return. Veteran commanders like Johannes Steinhoff and Walter Dahl recorded their despair. We trained them quickly, too quickly. Many went into their first battle with only a dozen hours in the 109. Against the Mustangs, they never had a chance. Steinhoff Memoirs in the Skies of Europe, 1960. Losses among German instructors and squadron leaders were catastrophic. The Luftwaffe could replace planes. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs factories continued to churn them out, but it could not replace experience. Pilots of the 4th, 354th and 357th Fighter Groups quickly recognized the new reality. The P-51 was fast enough to chase down 109s, rugged enough to survive heavy flak and, most importantly, enduring enough to reach Berlin and back. Colonel Don Blakesley, once sceptical of cardboard tanks, now called the Mustang the weapon that would win the air war. In his March 1944 combat report, he wrote, "We no longer fight on German terms. They come to us, and we are ready, no matter how deep we go. The drop tank is the key. It has changed everything." 4th FG Records, USAAF Archives. Bomber crews echoed the sentiment. After years of dread, they could now look out their plexiglass windows and see escorts still flying wing at the target. The Mustang became, in their words, the little friend that saved them. Big Week's destruction of aircraft plants was only part of the story. The larger effect was the attrition of the Luftwaffe fighter force. Between February and March 1944, German losses exceeded 30% of their frontline fighters. By spring, when the Allies launched D-Day, the Luftwaffe would be a shadow of its former self. The US Strategic Bombing Survey later concluded the introduction of long-range escort fighters, particularly the P-51 with external tanks, was the decisive factor in achieving air superiority over Germany. Big Week marked the point of no return for the Luftwaffe. USSBS, European Theatre, 1945. For Allied crews, the psychological shift was just as significant as the tactical one. Lieutenant Jack Ilfrey of the 20th Fighter Group described the new confidence. Before, every mile east of the Rhine felt like suicide. Now we knew we could fight all the way to Berlin. That knowledge changed everything. We weren't just surviving, we were winning. 20th FG Memoirs, Happy Jack's Go Buggy, 1945. The Mustang, once an outsider in the American arsenal, had become the symbol of hope. Its silhouette, graceful wings, long nose and belly scoop was recognized from England to the Russian front. Even German civilians, peering skyward in 1944, began to call them Langstreckenjäger, long-range hunters. By the end of March 1944, the Luftwaffe still flew, but the tide had turned. The Americans could now strike deep into the Reich with escort cover. Berlin, once unreachable, was bombed in daylight with fighter protection. The myth of invulnerability was gone, and with it, the Luftwaffe's strategic dominance. Big Week had demonstrated more than just industrial might. It revealed the ingenuity of a simple solution, a disposable tank of paper and glue that carried the Allies across the threshold. As General Jimmy Doolittle summarized in his April 1944 address to the 8th Air Force, "Gentlemen, the drop tank has won us the war in the air. From here on, it is only a matter of time. 8th Air Force Records, AFHRA. March 6, 1944. Morning over northern Germany. At 8:30 a.m., more than 700 B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 liberators crossed the Dutch coast. Their target was unprecedented, the heart of the Reich, Berlin itself. In their bomb bays, 1,600 tons of high explosives. And this time, for the first time, they would not be alone. Flanking them in disciplined wings flew squadrons of P-51 Mustangs, each with 2 paper tanks swaying beneath its wings. Painted olive drab or gleaming silver, they held their place as the bombers droned eastward. Crewmen inside the fortresses whispered in disbelief. The escorts weren't turning back. Berlin had always been more than a city. It was a symbol. For the Allies, striking it in daylight would prove their doctrine of precision bombing and demonstrate that no corner of Nazi Germany was safe. For the Luftwaffe, it was the line in the sand. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring had once sneered, "No enemy bomber will reach the Ruhr. If one does, call me Meyer." Now, 2 years later, American bombers flew not only over the Ruhr, but toward the Reich's capital. In the cockpits of the P-51s, pilots understood the magnitude of their task. Lieutenant Clarence Bud Anderson of the 357th Fighter Group later recalled, "We weren't just flying an escort mission. We were writing history. If we could fight the Luftwaffe over Berlin and win, then the air war was decided." Anderson Memoir, To Fly and Fight, 1990. Berlin's defenders knew the stakes as well. Jagdgeschwader 11, 26, and 54 scrambled from airfields across northern Germany. Focke-Wulfs 190s and Messerschmitt 109Gs clawed into the sky. By mid-morning, more than 500 German fighters were converging on the bomber stream. Oberleutnant Heinz Knocker of JG-54 described the moment in his diary. "We waited for the usual turning point when the escorts vanish. But today the Mustangs came with them all the way. Suddenly we were the ones outnumbered." Bundesarchive, JG-54 diary. For the first time, the Luftwaffe faced a true long-range escort force over the Reich's heart. The clash was brutal. As the bombers approached Hanover, the Luftwaffe threw in head-on attacks, 20 and 30 at a time. The Mustangs dove to intercept, slashing into German formations before they could reach the B-17 boxes. Pilots reported duels at altitudes from 10,000 to 30,000 feet, contrails twisting into violent spirals. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group claimed 3 victories that morning, one in a 109 that exploded so close he thought his own wings were gone. Lieutenant Chuck Yeager, then a rookie in the 357, scored his first kill near Wittenberg, chasing a Messerschmitt down through clouds to within sight of the Elbe. Meanwhile, the bombers pressed on. At 11:45 a.m., the first B-17 formations reached Berlin's defences. Sirens wailed across the city. Flak batteries unleashed a storm, but the bombs began to fall. In the Kreuzberg and Tempelhof districts, rail yards erupted in flames. A weapons plant at Aachen was flattened. Witnesses described black smoke columns rising over the capital, visible for 50 miles. German civilians recorded the shock. Ursula von Kardorf, a Berlin diarist, wrote, "We were told daylight raids could never happen here. Yet today the sky was full of silver bombers, and the earth shook beneath us. Berlin is no longer untouchable." Von Kardorf Diary, 1944. The Luftwaffe fought desperately to break the formations, but every time a Staffel clawed at the bombers, Mustangs fell upon them. For every fortress that went down, 2 German fighters followed. By the end of the day, the 8th Air Force had lost 69 bombers, over 700 men missing or killed. For the crews of those fortresses, the cost was terrible. Yet the Luftwaffe's toll was worse. More than 160 fighters destroyed and dozens of veteran pilots lost. Major Hubert Zemke of the 56th Fighter Group summarized it in his after-action report. "For the first time, the Luftwaffe could not drive us away from the target. The bombers struck Berlin in daylight and came home with fighters still beside them. This is the turning point. 8th AF debriefing, March 1944. In Berlin, Göring raged. When informed that American fighters had been seen over the capital, he reportedly shouted, "That is impossible. The Americans cannot have such range." But his own officers confirmed the reports. Göring, pale with disbelief, muttered, "If that is true, then we have already lost the war." Post-war interrogation, 1946. His fear was justified. The Luftwaffe had been forced into the defensive battle it could not afford. Each raid drained irreplaceable pilots. Each dogfight eroded the core of Germany's air strength. For American bomber crews, the raid was both terrifying and vindicating. Sergeant Ralph Manning, a B-17 radio operator, later recalled, "We lost friends that day. But when we looked out the windows over Berlin and saw those P-51s still flying with us, it felt like a miracle. We weren't abandoned anymore." National World War II Museum oral testimonies. The psychological shift was immense. What had once been missions of despair, like Schweinfurt, were now endured with the knowledge that little friends would be there all the way. Berlin would not be bombed only once. In March and April 1944, the 8th Air Force returned repeatedly. Railway yards, industrial districts, and military depots were pounded. For the first time, Berliners faced the full weight of daylight precision bombing, combined with the RAF's night raids. Civilians sought refuge in cellars and subway tunnels as the capital's infrastructure crumbled. The Luftwaffe scrambled again and again, but its strength waned. By May, German commanders privately admitted they could no longer guarantee the defense of Berlin. The city was under siege from the air. The raids on Berlin were more than symbolic. They disrupted transport lines, scattered production, and forced the Luftwaffe into costly battles it could not sustain. Historian Richard Overy later wrote, "The true target of the Berlin raids was not the city itself, but the Luftwaffe. And in that aim, the missions succeeded." The Bombers and the Bombed, 2013. By drawing the German fighter force into the skies over the Reich, the Americans bled it white. When D-Day came in June 1944, the Luftwaffe would be too depleted to resist. As the smoke cleared over Berlin in March 1944, the message was unmistakable. The Reich's heart was no longer safe. The combination of drop tanks, P-51 Mustangs, and relentless bomber streams had changed the balance of power. What had once seemed unreachable was now routinely bombed in daylight. The Luftwaffe, once the hunter, had become the hunted. Berlin in flames marked the true beginning of Germany's aerial defeat. June 1944. The skies over France. As dawn broke on June 6th, waves of Allied bombers crossed the Channel to support the Normandy landings. Above them flew squadrons of P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, and P-38 Lightnings. The Luftwaffe's response was faint, almost an echo of its once ferocious presence. In all of northern France that morning, fewer than 300 German fighters managed to sortie. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, watching the reports flow into SHAEF headquarters, turned to his air chiefs and remarked, "The enemy air force has been bled to death." SHAEF headquarters report, June 1944. That summer, the Luftwaffe did not simply falter, it crumbled. The reasons were manifold: relentless escort missions, crippling fuel shortages, and an attritional air campaign that consumed pilots faster than they could be trained. The decisive role of the long-range P-51 and its ungainly drop tanks now became brutally clear. The introduction of escorts over Berlin in March had forced the Luftwaffe into repeated head-on clashes with American fighters. Unlike in 1943, when they could choose their battles against defenseless bomber streams, by mid-1944 they had no choice. Every attempt to intercept bombers meant tangling with Mustangs. The numbers told the story. In May 1944 alone, German fighter units lost 1,500 aircraft, more than 3 times the number lost the previous May. Worse than the machines were the men. Pilots like Walter Ossau, commander of JG-1, were killed in combat. Johannes Mackie Steinhoff noted bitterly, "We threw boys into the sky with barely a dozen hours training. They were meat for the Mustangs." Steinhoff, The Final Hours, 1960. By June, many Jagdgeschwader were down to 50% strength, their Gruppen filled with teenagers barely out of flight school. If attrition in combat was one blade, the other was the Allied oil campaign. Beginning in May 1944, American bombers, escorted by P-51s, systematically targeted Germany's synthetic fuel plants, Leuna, Merseburg, and Pölitz. The effect was immediate. Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments, later confessed, "It was the oil attacks, escorted by the Mustangs, that finished us. Without fuel, even the best fighter was useless." Nuremberg Testimony, 1946. German records show aviation gasoline production dropped by 90% between May and September 1944. Fighter units often received just a few gallons per sortie, barely enough for takeoff, climb, and one combat engagement. Pilots were ordered to glide landings to conserve fuel. Meanwhile, American P-51s, fueled by massive Allied reserves, roamed at will. They swept ahead of bomber formations, strafed airfields, and destroyed Luftwaffe aircraft on the ground before they could even take off. The strain on German airmen was immense. Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Ossenkopf of JG 300 described his unit's plight in July 1944. "We had new planes but no fuel. When we did fly, we were outnumbered 10 to 1. The Mustangs came in from every direction, above and below. Many of my comrades never fired a shot before they were killed." ATIS Interrogation Report, 1945. Morale plummeted. Once proud Jagdgeschwader veterans watched their squadrons dissolve into lists of missing men. Some pilots, exhausted and hopeless, deliberately crash-landed rather than face impossible odds. At the same time, Allied pilots grew increasingly confident. Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group told his men in July, "Gentlemen, this is our time. The Luftwaffe is beaten, but we will finish the job. Every German fighter destroyed on the ground is one less our bombers will face over France." 352nd Fighter Group Records, July 1944. The ultimate proof of the Luftwaffe's decline came during Operation Overlord. On June 6th and the days that followed, German fighter appearances were so rare that infantrymen on the beaches remembered only occasional strafing runs. The feared waves of Stukas and FW-190s never materialized. American after-action reports counted fewer than 300 Luftwaffe sorties on D-Day, compared to over 14,000 Allied sorties. The imbalance was staggering. Historian Richard Hallion later summarized, "The Luftwaffe had ceased to be a factor in determining outcomes. Air superiority was complete, and it belonged to the Allies. Strike from the Sky, 1989. For the Mustang pilots, escort duty expanded into search and destroy missions. They no longer merely protected bombers, they hunted the Luftwaffe wherever it hid. Strafing runs over German airfields became daily routine. In June and July alone, P-51 groups claimed over 1,000 aircraft destroyed on the ground. The despair is evident in post-war German accounts. Adolf Galland, once the celebrated fighter general, admitted, "The moment long-range escort appeared over Germany, our cause was lost. We could neither train nor fuel our pilots fast enough. It was a war of machines, and the Americans had more." Galland, The First and the Last, 1954. Hans-Ulrich Rudel, famed Stuka pilot, recalled his horror at seeing swarms of Mustangs over Silesia. "They seemed without end. Every sortie meant loss. We were overwhelmed not by courage, but by numbers and endurance." Rudel Memoir, 1949. The very idea that Berlin, Leipzig, and Hamburg could be bombed daily under Escort was something the Luftwaffe had once considered impossible. Now it was routine. For the Americans, the summer of 1944 was the season of dominance. Bomber crews who had once feared the dreaded bandits at 12 o'clock now looked out their windows to see friendly fighters still on station. Sergeant James Rowe, a B-17 top turret gunner, recalled a July mission over Merseburg. The flak was bad, but the fighters never got near us. Mustangs were everywhere. They chased the Jerrys before they could line up. I knew then the air war was ours. 8th AF Oral Histories, 1985 reunion. Pilots, too, felt the change. Captain Bud Anderson described his summer missions simply, "We owned the sky." Anderson Memoir, 1990. By late summer 1944, Luftwaffe fighter strength in the West had been reduced to fragments. What remained was tied down defending the oil plants and transport networks being pounded daily. Young replacements, barely trained, were thrown into hopeless odds. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey concluded, from June 1944 onward, the Luftwaffe ceased to exist as an effective fighting force in the West. Its destruction was achieved not by numbers alone, but by the range and persistence of American escort fighters. USSBS, European Theatre, 1945. In August 1944, Albert Speer confided to a colleague, "The drop tank has done more damage to Germany than any single invention. It carried the war to the last refuge of our industry and shattered the shield of our skies." Speer, Inside the Third Reich, 1970. By then, the truth was undeniable. The Luftwaffe, once Europe's terror, was broken, and the weapon that had tipped the balance was not just the Mustang itself, but the flimsy paper tanks slung beneath its wings, symbols of ingenuity that carried death across the Reich. September 1944. The front lines of Europe had shifted dramatically. Allied armies had broken out of Normandy, Paris had been liberated, and the Luftwaffe, once feared as the Black Cross in the sky, was now a shattered shadow of its former self. Yet even in collapse, remnants of the German Air Force continued to fight, driven by desperation, propaganda, and a flicker of professional pride. The Mustangs, with their ungainly drop tanks, were everywhere. By autumn, their dominance was absolute. No German city, factory, or military column was safe from their reach. The unreachable target of Berlin was now visited daily by bomber formations escorted by American fighters from takeoff to return. For the Luftwaffe, the end had begun. As Allied forces advanced toward the German border, the air war pressed deeper. Escort missions ranged far beyond Berlin into East Prussia, Silesia, and Hungary. The Luftwaffe was stretched to defend too many targets at once: oil fields in Romania, transportation hubs in Germany, and crumbling fronts in both East and West. Fuel shortages worsened. By September, most operational units received barely 30% of their needs. Some Jagdgeschwader reported no flying days at all. Adolf Galland, by then marginalized but still respected, wrote grimly, "We were fighting a war of ghosts, aircraft without fuel, units without pilots. The Americans, meanwhile, appeared in endless waves. Galland, the first and the last, 1954. The Mustang squadrons, operating with the freedom of near-total superiority, began fighter sweeps deep into German territory. They attacked airfields, railways, and even motor convoys. This campaign bled the Luftwaffe of what little strength remained, hitting not only machines but the infrastructure that supported them. The autumn skies over Germany were grey and cold, but they offered no reprieve. Bomber missions continued, though weather sometimes hampered precision. The escorts were always there. P-51 pilots often described the eerie quiet of missions where no enemy appeared, testament to the Luftwaffe's exhaustion. Yet there were still battles. In November 1944, during a raid on Merseburg, German fighters massed in one of their last concentrated efforts. Nearly 300 Bf-109s and FW-190s rose to intercept the bomber stream. They inflicted losses, downing more than 40 bombers, but the Mustangs exacted a ruinous price. US records credit over 100 German fighters destroyed in that single engagement. 8th AF Combat Report, November 2, 1944. One pilot of JG-300, Oberfeldwebel Heinz Eckart, later recalled, "We attacked because we had no choice. It was slaughter. The Mustangs fell upon us like wolves. Half my Staffel did not return." ATIS interrogation, 1945. The Luftwaffe's gambles could no longer alter the balance. Each mass sortie only accelerated its destruction. The last major gamble came with the Ardennes offensive. On December 16th, Hitler launched his desperate counterattack through the Ardennes forest, hoping to split the Allied front. For the offensive to succeed, the Luftwaffe had to shield German ground forces from Allied air power. Initially, bad weather did what the Luftwaffe could not. Low clouds and snow grounded many Allied aircraft, giving German armour temporary breathing room. But when skies cleared on December 23rd, the Mustangs returned with vengeance. They strafed columns, destroyed fuel depots, and cut German supply lines. Then came Operation Bodenplatte, launched on January 1st, 1945. Conceived as a surprise strike against Allied airfields in the Low Countries, it was meant to cripple enemy tactical air power. At dawn, nearly 900 German fighters roared low across the front, catching some airfields unprepared. For a few hours, the Luftwaffe had its last triumph. Allied aircraft were destroyed on the ground, over 400 in total. But the cost was catastrophic. More than 300 German fighters lost, and many of their best remaining pilots killed. The blow was final. As historian Donald Caldwell noted, Bodenplatte was not the Luftwaffe's resurrection, but its suicide. Caldwell, JG 26 War Diary, 1996. By early 1945, the Reich was collapsing on all fronts. In the skies, the situation was even worse. Allied fighters now operated over central and eastern Germany without opposition. P-51 groups flew deep penetration missions into Czechoslovakia and Austria, ranging freely over the ruins of the Reich. Fuel reserves were nearly gone. Many German fighter units had planes but no gasoline to fly them. Training schools closed, and green recruits were rushed to the front with as little as 10 to 15 flight hours. Against seasoned American and British aces, their survival time was measured in minutes. In March 1945, during the Ruhr encirclement, Mustang pilots reported shooting down dozens of German fighters that attempted to oppose the bombers. These combats often ended before they began. Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group summed it up. "They came up and we knocked them down. It was no longer war, it was execution." 352nd Fighter Group debriefing, March 1945. By April, the Luftwaffe was finished. Its remaining strength was scattered, unable to mass even a few dozen fighters for any given sortie. On April 7th, in one of its final desperate acts, a small force of jet-powered Me-262s attempted to intercept American bombers near Berlin. Though faster, the jets were too few, too late, and constantly vulnerable to Mustangs as they climbed and landed. Allied pilots now often encountered empty skies. Sergeant Harold Bennett, a B-24 gunner, remembered, "We flew over Berlin in April. There was flak, plenty of flak, but no fighters. For us, that was the miracle. We knew the war was over." 8th AF Oral Histories, 1985, Reunion. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered. The Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force weeks earlier. Its destruction was not simply the work of overwhelming Allied numbers, but the direct consequence of one invention, the drop tank. In post-war analyses, German officers consistently cited the Mustang's long-range Escort as decisive. At the 1962 U.S.-German Aviation History Symposium, former Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland put it plainly: we could fight the bombers, we could fight the fighters, but we could not fight both at once, day after day, when they reached Berlin, Leipzig and beyond. The drop tank turned the war. Symposium Proceedings, 1962. Albert Speer's words echoed that assessment. The Luftwaffe was not defeated by lack of courage, but by lack of reach. The Americans solved their problem with a simple device of tin and fuel. That device broke the backbone of our defense. Inside the Third Reich, 1970. For the U.S. Army Air Forces, the campaign ended with validation of daylight precision bombing doctrine, something that had seemed doomed in 1943. Escort fighters had transformed heavy bomber losses into sustainable missions, allowing the Allies to strike at Germany's industrial heart and cripple its war-making ability. The Mustang became the symbol of that achievement. Its sleek lines and drop tanks represented more than an engineering solution. They symbolized the collapse of Hitler's last shield. Berlin, once beyond reach, had fallen under daily bombardment. As General Karl Spaatz reflected after the war, the Escort fighter was the key. Without it, our bomber offensive would have failed. With it, the Luftwaffe died, and victory came within our grasp. Spaatz Papers, Air Force Historical Research Agency. When the war ended in May 1945, the skies over Europe were no longer the domain of the Luftwaffe. What had begun in 1943 as a desperate gamble, the belief that escort fighters could carry daylight bombing to the heart of Germany, had been proven not only possible but decisive. At the centre of that revolution was a simple invention: the drop tank. In its essence, the drop tank was unimpressive: sheet metal, fuel lines and bolts. Yet it extended the Mustang's range by hundreds of miles, transforming a regional interceptor into a continental escort. What German planners had dismissed as impossible, the appearance of American fighters over Berlin, Leipzig and Vienna, became a daily nightmare. The statistics were stark. Between March 1944 and the end of the war, the Luftwaffe lost more than 25,000 aircraft in the West. Pilot casualties were irreplaceable. Many of the aces of 1940–41 fell in the skies of 1944, replaced by recruits who barely knew their aircraft. American bomber losses, once catastrophic, dropped sharply after full escort became standard. In missions that once cost 60 aircraft in a single day, losses now averaged fewer than 5. Post-war testimony confirmed the significance. At the 1962 U.S.-German Aviation Symposium, Adolf Galland reflected, "The Mustang, with its drop tanks, destroyed our last hope. Without fuel, without rest, we could not fight. It was not just a weapon, it was the end of strategy." Albert Speer echoed this view in his memoirs, writing that the oil campaign, made possible by long-range escorts, crippled Germany's war industry more effectively than any other Allied strategy. For American airmen, the lesson was clear: air superiority required persistence, not just power. The drop tank provided that persistence, enabling fighters to stay with bombers for the entire mission. The doctrine shaped not only the closing stages of World War II, but the design of post-war air power. Jets like the F-86 Sabre and later the F-15 Eagle carried the same lesson forward. Range, endurance, and flexibility were as critical as speed or firepower. In museums today, Mustangs often sit with their elegant lines polished to a shine, but veterans who flew them remember the ungainly tanks slung beneath the wings. Lieutenant Colonel Bud Anderson once remarked at a 1985 reunion, "The P-51 was the best plane I ever flew. But it wasn't just the Mustang, it was those drop tanks. Without them, we'd have been back in England while our bombers were dying over Germany." The Luftwaffe never recovered from that reality. The unreachable target had been reached, struck, and devastated. And the war in Europe ended with the clear demonstration that even the most powerful fortress in the air could be breached. not by brute force alone, but by ingenuity in extending the fight. The drop tank was a modest invention, but it carried the weight of victory. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe in May 1945, the war in the air had told a story of both technology and endurance. At the heart of that story lay a paradox. Victory hinged not on a dramatic new invention, but on something deceptively simple: the external fuel tank. The drop tank was neither glamorous nor elegant, yet, strapped beneath the wings of the Mustang, it became the instrument that extended the reach of Allied power, toppled the Luftwaffe, and reshaped the very nature of modern air warfare. The success of the long-range Escort campaign was reflected in statistics that stunned even Allied planners. In 1943, deep penetration bombing missions over Germany had been near suicidal. The Schweinfurt Regensburg raid, for instance, cost the 8th Air Force 60 bombers in a single day, a loss rate unsustainable for even the largest industrial power. By early 1944, however, with Mustangs escorting the bombers to Berlin and beyond, loss rates fell to manageable levels, often below 5%. The strategic results followed quickly. Factories in Leipzig, Hamburg and the Ruhr, once safe under the Luftwaffe's umbrella, were bombed repeatedly. Oil production collapsed after May 1944 as escorts allowed bombers to loiter over refineries and synthetic plants without fear of interception. By late summer, German gasoline output had been reduced by over 90%. Tanks and trucks ran dry. Fighter units had to ration fuel for even short sorties. The German war machine, already strained, buckled. It was not simply the bombs themselves that broke the Reich's economy, but the fact that bombers could now reach their targets day after day, unimpeded. This continuity was possible only because fighters had the endurance to match them. For bomber crews, the difference was visceral. Veterans of 1943 remembered missions over Germany as nightmares of fire and steel, endless waves of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs slicing into their formations. Gunner memoirs are filled with images of burning B-17s tumbling earthward. By contrast, the men who flew in 1944 and 1945 told a different story. Yes, flak remained deadly, but the skies were no longer dominated by German fighters. Sergeant James Rowe, a top turret gunner, recalled, "It was the strangest thing. In 43 we prayed for a glimpse of a friendly fighter. By 44 there they were, all around us, the Mustangs. They stayed with us, right to the target and home again. We called them angels with drop tanks." 8th AF Oral Histories, 1985 reunion. For Mustang pilots, the campaign forged a sense of pride. Escort was grueling, often monotonous, but the payoff came when they intercepted a German attack and saved dozens of bombers. Many spoke of the satisfaction of hunting down Luftwaffe planes on the ground, preventing them from ever reaching the bombers at all. On the German side, the effect was despair. Pilots who had once been the hunters now felt hunted themselves. Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Ossenkopf of JG 300 confessed in a 1945 interrogation, "When we saw the tanks under their wings, we knew we would face them over Berlin, over Leipzig, everywhere. It was a hopeless feeling." ATIS Interrogation Report, 1945. The Luftwaffe's last great gamble, Operation Bodenplatte in January 1945, illustrated how far the balance had shifted. Nearly 900 German fighters attacked Allied airfields in the Low Countries, destroying more than 400 aircraft. Yet the cost, over 300 German fighters lost, was crippling. Many were irreplaceable veterans. The operation revealed a tragic truth. Even bold tactical victories could not offset the strategic collapse wrought by long-range Escort. The Allies could replace their losses within days. The Luftwaffe could not. The very scale of American industrial and logistical power, delivered by the endurance of the Mustang, meant Germany had no path back. The lessons of 1944 and 1945 reverberated long after the war. range and persistence became central to air doctrine. Aircraft design shifted away from short-range interceptors toward multi-role fighters with endurance and versatility. In Korea, the F-86 Sabre carried drop tanks into combat. In Vietnam, the F-4 Phantom and later the F-105 Thunderchief relied on external tanks for strike and escort missions. Even modern aircraft, from the F-15 to the F-16, continue to fly with external fuel tanks as standard. Historians and aviators alike pointed to a fundamental shift. Air superiority is not won by speed alone, but by presence. The Mustang and its drop tanks made clear that victory required fighters to go wherever the bombers went, and to stay there. After the war, the Mustang became an icon of Allied victory. Its sleek profile and combat record earned it a revered place in aviation history. Yet many veterans were quick to remind audiences that the glamour of the Mustang was only part of the story. Lieutenant Colonel Bud Anderson, a triple ace of the 357 fighter group, said at a 1985 reunion, "Everyone remembers the Mustang as the great plane it was, but don't forget those ugly tanks hanging under the wings. They were the real heroes. Without them, we wouldn't have been over Berlin, and the bombers wouldn't have come home." In Germany, the narrative was darker. Former Luftwaffe aces acknowledged the courage of their men, but admitted the war was unwinnable once American fighters gained reach. Adolf Galland summed it up with chilling clarity. "We had no answer. The day the Mustangs appeared over Berlin, the war was lost in the air." Galland, the First and the Last, 1954. The story of the drop tank underscores a larger truth about war. Often it is not the most complex invention that turns the tide, but the simplest. While radar, jets, and rockets captured imaginations, it was a bolted-on cylinder of fuel that enabled strategic bombing to fulfill its purpose and cripple the enemy. By extending the Mustang's range, the drop tank ensured that the Reich's skies were no longer a sanctuary. Factories, refineries, and transport hubs all could be reached and destroyed. The Luftwaffe, starved of fuel and men, withered under the pressure. The Luftwaffe had once believed Berlin was untouchable. By 1944, that illusion had been shattered. The sight of Mustangs with drop tanks escorting bombers over the German capital symbolized not only technological triumph, but strategic inevitability. The broader lesson endures. Wars are won not only by courage or numbers, but by solving the problem of endurance. The P-51 with its ungainly tanks did just that. It turned daylight bombing from a gamble into a certainty, broke the Luftwaffe, and hastened the end of the European war. In the end, the Luftwaffe never expected the Americans to bring fighters to Berlin. When they did, the outcome of the air war, and perhaps of the war itself, was sealed.